if you have heard at least 3 friends or people you know say, I hate school. Okay, now open your eyes and stay standing. So what you're seeing is that everyone around you knows someone who has said, I hate school before, and you can sit back down now. But it seems also that almost everyone has also said at some point in their life, I hate school. So someone, please tell me, when did you say it? What do you remember about that moment, and what made you hate school? Does anyone want to volunteer?
Yes. I remember being in school and feeling uninspired by the person I was listening to and thinking this is a waste of my time.
Being uninspired by the person you're listening to, feeling this is a waste of your time. Maybe some of you can relate to that same feeling. Yeah.
Knowing that most of what I was learning I was never going to need to know.
Knowing that most of what you were learning you were never going to need to know. I can definitely relate to that. If any of you have seen this really catchy YouTube video, it's based on the song Somebody That I Used to Know. It's called Some Study That I Used to Know. And it uses the same tune, and it's just singing about all these things that you learned and then don't really use in the real world. What are some other things? What have you said as reasons before? Yep.
The teachers were mean.
The teachers were mean? I feel you. As someone who isn't allowed to make up labs that I miss when I'm traveling, I definitely feel that one. So we're hearing a lot of different reasons, but I'm definitely getting a few of the same. Oh yeah, me and back.
The teachers would some kind of teacher that was more nice to girls than boys and girly things, and yeah.
I'm sorry to hear that. So yeah, I think we have some issues sometimes with individual teachers. We have issues with being uninspired, whether by an individual teacher, perhaps by a classroom or school's culture. And we also see a disconnect between the things that we're learning and what we actually need in the world. I think that that's a pretty accurate summary of most of the reasons I've heard from my friends. And I wanted to come back to that, but first I'm going to start with a little passage that I read in a distinctly uninspiring place, a place where you usually don't find that great of pieces of writing, which was while taking the AP language test. So I was sitting there, and it was this passage, and I realized, well, this is actually kind of a cool excerpt. So it began by describing the trend of parents purchasing rear seat and in-dash multimedia entertainment products for the sake of a little backseat piece. So maybe some of you have these in your cars, like a TV for the kids in the back to watch or whatever else. And one of my favorite paragraphs in this went like this. Why do so many people no longer consider the physical world worth watching? The highway's edges may not be postcard perfect, but for a century, children's early understanding of how cities and nature fit together was gained from the back seat. The empty farmhouse at the edge of the subdivision, the variety of architecture here and there, the woods and fields and water beyond the seamy edges. All that was and is still available to the eye. This was the landscape that we watched as children. It was our drive-by movie. In our useful boredom, we used our fingers to draw pictures on fogged glass as we watched telephone poles tick by. We saw birds on wires and combines in the fields. We were fascinated with roadkill, and we counted cows and horses and coyotes and shaving cream signs. We stared with a kind of reverence at the horizon as thunderheads and dancing rain moved with us. We held our little plastic cars against the glass and pretended that they, too, were racing towards some unknown destination. We considered the past and dreamed of the future and watched it all go by in the blink of an eye. And that's a quote from Richard Loeb in Last Child in the Woods. And I thought about this especially because I was taking Amtrak and I realized that I pulled out my laptop to do work because Wi-Fi is on the trains now, yay. But also not yay because suddenly I was looking more at my screen than I was looking outside. And I was on a bus once from Singapore to Malaysia, and I was sitting 2 rows behind a little kid. He was on an iPad, and he was watching Gangnam Style on loop. Now, if anyone has sat behind a 5-year-old, there are multiple reasons why this is occasionally irritating on a really, really long journey. No offense to 5-year-olds in the audience, by the way. Y'all are great, I love you. But this particular 5-year-old had played Gangnam Style, let's say 4 times. And at this point, I had the lyrics so imprinted in my mind that when he started it up for the 5th time, I was very close to getting out of my seat, walking a few inches forward, grabbing the iPad, and smashing it over the little tyke's head. I should really think about those anger management classes. What was interesting though is not so much that he was watching Gangnam Style because he really liked K-pop, but rather that his mom had just instinctually handed him the iPad because he was being fidgety, and he basically needed to have something to hold his attention through this long bus ride. And more often I'm seeing devices being used this way as diversions, because God forbid that a child should be bored and look out the window or make noise or be a bother, but I think that it's sending sometimes a message of the idea that there can't be useful boredom, that whatever's outside the window isn't worth watching. And really, what's outside the window, who cares if on-screen cat talking Tom, maybe some of you have that app, is still purring, and if kamikaze birds are still being kamikaze birds and angry birds, or if you can still slice fruit like a boss in Fruit Ninja, whatever's outside probably can't stand up to that. But this is so different from what I experienced growing up. When I was pretty little, then my parents basically just sent us out into a backyard that was really sprawling and messy. We had lots and lots of random planks of wood and bricks and mud. It was all lying around. No, I did not live by a junkyard. But we had all this access to what we saw as tools and what my parents saw as junk. When I said I was bored, then I could go and do something. I would go play outside. Maybe I would write a poem or try my hand at origami, though I never got very far. When we prioritize keeping a kid occupied, somehow filling time, and we make this our first priority, then you might draw a child away from being bored, but you've also created a consumer where you might have otherwise had a producer. You might have otherwise had a kid who's making stuff and finding a way to fill their own time and fix their own boredom. Whether in education reform or organizational management, it's always vital to ask not just what kind of consumers, students, and clients you're creating, but if you're creating producers, if you're creating teachers. And I hope that if I ask you guys who here is a teacher, that you would all stand up. Because in truth, every single one of you is a teacher. You might not stand up in front of a classroom with a whiteboard and tell someone how to add 1 + 1, or significantly more complicated equations, but I know that you've taught someone something. Maybe you taught your best friend how to make a friendship bracelet. I still don't know how to do that, by the way, so if anyone wants to volunteer to teach me that. Maybe you taught someone what it is to be nice on the playground, or maybe you taught someone what it is to be nice at work. There are so many ways in which we are teachers in everyday life, and I think that that is often forgotten when we think about education, when we think about reform, and when we think about our perceptions of young people. So I think that we need to think about how we can enable students to realize that they are teachers, to realize they have that intrinsic gift, and make sure that they share it. And it's the curiosity that nature inspires, the view out the window on the bus or the car that the author describes so beautifully that gets people to make things, material or immaterial, and we need a generation of makers. I like to think that I was something of a pioneer in this field when I headed out to my family's backyard and put together inventions made out of mud and twigs that I'm sure would have put GE and Apple products to shame. I swear that they were useful. And soon my attention turned to not just making things with my hands, but making things with my mind. Because when I was around 5 years old, a friend told me, "Oh, I hate to read and write." And I was like, "What? How is this possible? You just shattered my worldview." If I had that vocabulary at that age. But I really thought everyone was like me, which meant that everyone must have liked to read and write. So I decided I've got to change that, and I started going to schools with a crate full of stuffed animals and passing them out to people and asking, what should we write about? Let's name characters and let's write stories. And I realized that it was really truly this magic happened when we collaborated, when we worked together, when I asked them questions and they contributed. And it wasn't just me having a top-down approach. It wasn't just me saying, here's the right way to write, and I'm going to write a story now and you're going to sit and listen. Instead, the magic happened when I asked them for their ideas, and that's how we managed to write crazy free-verse poems about ninjas with bladder control problems. Because that is exactly the kind of awesome thing that first-grade boys come up with, and girls. I found that it was an incredibly rare break for many of these kids to break out of this diet of fill-in-the-blank activities, where they had been given very safe and sanitized series of words and they had to just throw in one from the word bank. And I realized that it's when we take risks and when we aren't afraid to do gross things or funny things that maybe made the teachers squirm a little bit that we really got kids excited. My friend Priya gave a speech at the TEDx event I organized, and she told an anecdote about how when she was in middle school, she was instructed to write a poem about winter, but half of the words were already provided. Is that really writing a poem? So exploiting the liberty that we have when we actually get to write, when we get to write everything, we were able to come up with characters who were as ridiculous as they were beautiful. And I think that that made it more enjoyable for all of us. Unfortunately, I think that not all that much sometimes changes from our school days in the sense that we're expected to fill in blanks often. Many people don't feel as though they have the chance to work in jobs where they have creative freedom. It takes guts to work outside the status quo, and I greatly look up to the people who do that, who break out of the mold, to use that phrase. I had the privilege of visiting the MIT Media Lab when I was in Boston. And I visited a graduate student there named Jia Chi, and she's doing incredible things with technology, with art, and she calls it a combination of high and low tech. And what I found was that she pulls together all these disciplines that you might not think could be any more different. I mean, she studied engineering, and she studied all these very hardcore science things, and then she's using traditional Chinese paintings over top a network of LED circuits. So what you see in front of you as a viewer walking in is you see something like this basically. She drew a bunch of dandelions in ink. But then when you blow on the surface of the painting, then LED lights light up and they scatter because of the way that the circuits drive. So she's using this combination of inspiration from nature to create the dandelions, this classical Chinese painting, and she's using the technology underneath to create the illusion of dandelion seeds flying through the air at a single breath. I just did it again and again. I was captivated. I could not get enough of that because it was nothing like, basically I'd never seen anything like that before. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. And what I saw was that it was really powerful to not create these artificial separations, to say, oh, technology is technology, and that's for all these geeky guys who are super pasty white and never going outside, and all they do is stay inside their computers, and that's that group. And art is for these crazy, fun, hippie people who wear cool glasses and have super long hair and wear flower dresses. I'm not sure what else to stereotype there, but yeah, let's call those the artists. And they do their art. And never the twain shall meet. But we know that's not true, because there are people like this graduate student at the MIT Media Lab who is bringing all these layers of things together. And I saw how powerful that was when it happened in the real world, and I asked, why doesn't that happen more often in education? Why don't we see overlapping of nature and technology as seamlessly as a student at MIT Media Lab could do with a piece of paper and an LED circuit board? That was a pretty incredible moment for me, and I think it ties in really well with the idea of symbiotic learning. The best part was when she handed my sister and my friend this box of circuits and LEDs and batteries and wires, and she told us to build our own inventions. And quite honestly, I was really daunted because I did not see myself as a geeky person or someone who's very good with wires and stuff. If something goes wrong on my computer, I try a few different things, and then if all else fails, I call up one of my friends. And so I was scared to touch it, but I really look forward to trying. Now that I'm taking computer science and engineering class, I'm seeing even more fundamentally how people are not just limiting themselves in their experience and in their ideas to what they know about wires and batteries. They're bringing in so much knowledge from other fields. And it really does come back to thinking about it in the same way that a kid who's in their backyard with a bunch of mud and twigs thinks about things. And so people often ask me about how I became so opinionated on education reform. Why do I tie everything back to education? Why do I look at a bunch of red lines and think of schools? I think it started young, because when I was little, I was actually homeschooled. And I had all these friends who went to the local elementary school and who had really cool worksheets. And I was like, oh my god, I want your worksheets, they're so pretty. And I have to write whole paragraphs. Do you understand? You feel me, man? This really sucks. Again, my vocabulary may have been slightly different at that time. But in retrospect, I should not have been so envious. Because as someone who's now in high school, I realized that so many of the biggest problems in school can be alluded to with one fact. That it is perfectly normal that I expected that most of you would stand up for the I hate school statement. That it is normal for kids to say I hate school and parents to say, yeah, that's just kind of what happens. That it is normal for anyone to say that they don't want to go to school, that they have to be forced, that they have to be dragged out of bed, or they pretend to be sick. The reason that I travel internationally and speak about education is because, most simply, I want to see a future in which no one has to be forced to go to school, in which no one kicks and screams and says, I hate school. And I want every single school to look like a student dreamed it up, which requires three things: autonomy, curiosity, and balance. Not the most tricked out technology, not big data, not even the smartest students. I'm kicking it old school and saying that the things we need most in education are not new inventions, but things that we've had all along and simply lost. I remember distinctly hearing a speaker at a conference I attended a few years ago say this about education. He said, if you were to educate a child just in a natural setting at home, or you're out in the woods maybe, really kicking it old school, then what would you do? Would you sit him down in your living room and say, okay, you stay here for 1 hour, and after that 1 hour of reading or whatever else is up, then I will ring a little bell and you can go to the bathroom? And everybody just kind of looked at him, and then they thought, oh, okay, what he's saying is that it's not natural, the way that we have this like costume switching and everything. But I saw even more powerfully that it's not only not natural, but it's not conducive to learning. Because the way that I learn is I check out 17 books from the library, yes, I'm quite a bookworm, and I sit on my couch and I spend 4 hours reading about rabies or this novel. Yeah, it was a really good book, one about rabies. And I get really, really into it. I start foaming at the mouth like I am one of those dogs with rabies in the book. And I realized that that's not the type of learning that can really happen when you're telling kids, okay, now we're going to learn about A, then B, and we're going to like do it in this very orderly fashion. It's super separate, and you have different teachers start every single one of these things, and it only can happen at a given time. But learning isn't something that only happens when you want it to and how you want it to. Learning sneaks in, and learning is about many, many different subjects that can't be restricted to just like 4 or 5 or 6. So for me, I've learned best, not because of regimented timelines and very linear curriculums, but because of personal relationships. Think about that for a moment, personal relationships. When you think about learning, maybe you think more of subjects. You think about the topics you learn. You think about math or history or science or dates and time, but I extend learning to be much more than that. I mean, everything I've learned in my short life. Think for a moment about the most important lesson you've ever learned, inside or outside of school. And I'm willing to bet quite a lot that it wasn't how to solve a quadratic equation, that it wasn't how to analyze Romeo and Juliet, that it was something deep and meaningful about who you were, or how to make a moral decision, or what was right. These are the kinds of lessons that we often don't learn in school. And sometimes I wonder how I walk away from certain long conversations in the wee hours of the night feeling so much smarter and curious about all the things in the world I don't know, and then I realize that that is naturally how learning usually happens. That's how learning happened for ages, through conversations. The dialogue in Plato's Symposium may have been fictional, but his Platonic Academy was not. That school didn't really have a particular doctrine or a formal distinction between who the teachers were and who the students were, but they believed that everyone could pose good problems to be studied and solved by the others. Learning through asking questions and solving problems with peers and teachers requires independence from students, but it's independence that many adults fear is unreasonable to expect. There's a tremendous irony to be found in the fact that for years and years we're taught to follow instructions to the letter, to fill in blanks, and then when we're thrown into an environment where we have fewer assignments, more free time and choice, that we're not ready. That environment, of course, is called college. And I find it surprising that so much of the emphasis on college readiness and career readiness focuses on more drilling for tests and more filling in blanks and following instructions, instead of the realization that so much of why students fail is because they've forgotten how to fill their own free time without someone telling them how to. We haven't had that time to stare out the windows and decide that we want to write poems. I found so much independence through my time in nature. Some of my best poems have been dreamt up on hikes through the woods when I got really sentimental about weeping willow trees. And it's probably a sign of an overambitious ego, but I like to think that I'm following the steps of authors like Henry David Thoreau, whose famous Walden was the result of spending months in solitude on the shore of Walden Pond. People often question the realism of such independence, though. Can students really be trusted? And if you give students the chance to engage with nature, to truly observe and learn from their surroundings, won't they just slack off? Well, I know of a student whose schooling ended when he was 10. Another left in his mid-teens, and another had barely a year's worth of school, and all were sent off to work when they were really young. Do you feel sorry for these kids and wish that they had had a chance to have more education and, all the rest? Would you say you feel sorry for them? Raise your hands if you feel sorry for them. Okay, so they were sent off to work, their schooling ended, one of them had schooling end when he was 10. You feel sorry for this kid. Okay, I'm seeing some nods and hands. Well, their names are Benjamin Franklin, George Bernard Shaw, and Abraham Lincoln, respectively. I know that they may be from another time, but my point in bringing up their stories is to say that independence is not something that necessarily has to be taught to students. It's something that we should never lose. Franklin and Shaw and Lincoln were certainly extraordinary individuals who were really bright, and education was less easily accessible and commonplace in the past. But I see the exact same traits they exhibited of a voracious appetite for books and independence and the desire to problem solve and ask interesting questions in so many of my classmates. I see it in my friends, and I see it in kids just like some of you in the audience, I think. I also see those traits squashed every day in school. Antoine Saint-Exupéry once said, "If you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea." I want this to be exactly what education does. I want this to be what my education is. Nature creates that yearning and curiosity naturally. If you've ever put a kid in the middle of the forest and just watch them take off, they ask why the leaves are green and why the sky is blue, and so many other questions. There are earthworms to poke. Okay, don't actually poke earthworms, that's kind of rude. And dirt to dig, and all sorts of other things to just observe and soak in and ask questions about. Because it's naturally, just like if you're sitting on the bus and you're watching the world pass by, there are so many ideas that can just come off of that. And it's an easy transition into learning in other subjects. When you ask those questions, like why are leaves green, why is the sky blue, and you get sentimental about a weeping willow tree, or you think about how, or why there's cuts in the side of an old stump, and you learn about logging in that area, then that naturally segues into history and science and writing and all these other subjects that we've been raised to traditionally isolate in school. And I think that there's also another aspect, which is that when kids are surrounded by nature, and even when adults are around the woods and they have to look up at towering redwoods or crazy different colors of mushrooms and all the other incredible things that are out there, they get a respect and they get a love that you can't produce outside. You can't produce it through just glossy pamphlets and asking people to sign up for the Sierra Club. You have to produce it by being there. And that's how you get citizens who care about preserving it and who care about keeping it safe. Politicians can easily toss down buzzwords about climate change and protecting the environment, but if someone has never seen what they're trying to protect, they'll have no incentive to do that. So creating this spirit of preserving nature in our future leaders begins with educating students with a grounding in the natural world early. The same way that we're born with curiosity or independence, I think that we're born with a desire for balance. We want to get enough sleep. Nobody goes out in the world and thinks, okay, I'm going to deprive myself of 5 days of sleep, like for fun. We get that checked out if you actually have that attitude. We want sufficient time with friends. We want sufficient time alone. We have this desire for balance. In my junior year, I forgot balance for quite a while. I forgot balance because I was ambitious. I was co-president of Model UN and speech and debate. I decided to join the wrestling team. I also decided to run a 5K and write a novel because it was November, National Novel Writing Month. And I was taking 4 AP classes. So what this resulted in was me in the school library after school, waiting for practices to start, and trying to do homework, but more often crashing and falling asleep and drooling unattractively. Any of you who have fallen asleep on top of homework and woken up and seen a large wet patch know, yeah, what's going on there? This life was not so unique because I know people who had to deal with doing a lot more than that. But this year I had to take a health class as a graduation requirement. I say I had to because it's a requirement most of my friends try to get out of. It's derided as an easy A. But it was one of my favorite classes because it taught me again to look for that balance that I had been forgetting. And I remember one day in health I asked to go use the bathroom, and instead of going to the bathroom I actually ran outside, and I just kept on running until I had gone across the street and I'd entered Hartman Park, which is the park across the street from my school. And obviously school wasn't out yet, so I wasn't supposed to be out there. Shh. And I just walked and I walked and I walked until I found the entrance to the woods, and then I walked a little further and I sat on this moss-covered log. And maybe I would have cried if I had known at that point in time that I'd failed my bio final. Maybe I would have gotten really angry and thrown some rocks, but it was so calming, and I just sat there and I inhaled the fresh air, and I think, peaced out. It was the closest I'd ever gotten to meditation outside of running, because honestly, I had a hard time. I couldn't force myself to just sit in class and calm down. I sort of just had to get out. And I realized that that was an opportunity I was really lucky to have. I was really lucky that nobody came looking for me or asked why I took 10 minutes to go to the bathroom, and that I also had a forest that was just pretty much right across the street, and that I had this chunk of time where I could sit there and collect my thoughts and relax. And it felt for a short moment like I had gotten my internal locus of control back. Like I was actually in control of how I felt and how my day was going. And that is a feeling that is out of reach for so many students. If you were a student and you walk through those school doors, and it feels like everyone else but you has a hold on how you feel. It feels like your friends who are telling you that you're not wearing the right clothes, you're not seeing the right boys, or whoever else. It feels like your friends are controlling how you feel and what you think. It feels like your teachers who just gave you those bad grades or gave you an F on the test or were mean to you. It feels like they're controlling how you feel and how you think. It feels like everyone else but you has control. So for me to go out there and sit on that mossy log and just breathe fresh air, it was a small, peaceful oasis in that desert. And I think that it is a chance that every single student should have to feel like they are independent, feel like they are in a place of balance and control, and that they can just sit and observe and learn in a way that is natural instead of one that is regimented and constricting. And I can also remember that people, when I tell them either that story or stories that are similar of how I want students to have control so that their mental health is preserved, so that they feel more comfortable in their learning environment, some people will say, well, that's all very nice, and it's great that you had a nice health teacher, and it's ideal to have nice people around, but school is supposed to be preparation for society, and society is not nice. Society doesn't hand you nice teachers all the time. It doesn't hand working adults enough time to take care of yourself. Life is just a rat race. I disagree. I think that we build what we want our society to be in our schools. Students want the balance that I found in that moment. Students want to be allowed to be curious by having access to nature that fuels their creative thoughts. The question is, will stakeholders in education do more than listen, but also take action? In asking this question to audiences, I often quote one of my favorite poems, which is Harlem by Langston Hughes. It reads, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sighs like a heavy load, or does it explode?" I quote it because every day teachers are walking into classrooms and staring at faces in rows upon rows of students with dreams deferred. Taking action is now more than ever an urgent moral imperative because we see how education could be better. We have more chances than ever to make change outside of our schools. Kids today are empowered to start petitions on change.org and act in their communities in ways that make their city better. And we realize that there are all these exciting possibilities in the world outside. So the contrast between these exciting possibilities and the arbitrary information that we memorize in school has become too great. So when I think about schools that facilitate independent learning and creative doing, I ask questions. What if schools were more like Plato's Academy in Greece, with more peer-to-peer learning and asking questions and problem solving? What if they were more like libraries in the sense of being open spaces, acting as portals to knowledge and discovery? We need spaces that inspire us and don't restrict us. Spaces that allow us to explore, discover, imagine, and make things. Spaces that allow us to be close to nature so we can draw that same inspiration that the kid on the bus might have if he had looked outside the window for once instead of just playing Gangnam Style on loop. When I talk to students a decade or two down the road, I want them to be amazed and incredulous when I say that when I went to school, everyone was expected to do things the same way, that if you wanted to do crazy, awesome things, like organize conferences or start nonprofits, you had to do them outside of school, that you didn't have the sense that you could change the world from your classroom chair. Really, what I'm about to say might just be a selfish desire for me in my last year in high school too. I desperately want those students of the future to be amazed, because I want them to know only a world where independent thinking and creative doing are the norm, and not the exceptions that slip through the cracks in our rigid schoolroom walls. There's a story that I grew up with as this bookworm who devoured Greek mythology, the story of Prometheus. Does anyone know the story of Prometheus? Some Greek mythology fans here? See a couple raised hands? Okay. So he lived up on Mount Olympus with all the rest of the Greek gods, and stuff was pretty happy there. And he went out amongst men to live with them, and he quickly noticed that they were unhappy. He wondered why. Well, he saw that they were living in caves and holes of the earth. They were shivering with cold, and they were dying of starvation, and they were hunted by wild beasts and one another. It was not a great place to live at that time. So Prometheus thought, if only they had, any guesses? Yes.
Fire.
Fire, exactly. If only they had fire. Because without fire, he said, they are worse off than the beasts. Prometheus went to Zeus. Yes?
And he stole the fire from Apollo's chariot.
Not quite. He went to Zeus and he stole it from Zeus's cave, I think?
No, Apollo's chariot.
Was it Apollo's chariot? Yeah, exactly. Okay, so he basically, Prometheus asked, can I have fire? And Zeus was all, no way, because humans are lower than us. Zeus said, not one spark will I share with them. I don't know if my voice effects do the king of the gods quite justice. But Prometheus had set his heart on helping mankind, so he found a tall stalk of fennel. This is just the elaboration. I know that we know the spoiler, but we have some details. So he broke off the stalk of fennel and he began journeying up Mount Olympus. He said that mankind would have fire, and so the story that I'm reading says he snuck quietly into Zeus's domain and stole a spark from his own lightning bolt, from Zeus's lightning bolt.
Oh,
There might be different versions.
I
but-
heard a different version of the book.
Yeah, but it could be Apollo's chariot or it could be Zeus's lightning bolt. We have two possibilities. And so Prometheus hurried back to his own land, the land of the men, and he carried with him the spark hidden in the hollow center of the fennel pit. And you have fire. Now, I tell this story because the people I know who have taken it into their own hands to make things, whether lessons or events or novels or high-tech artwork or schools, have the world in their hands ready for the shaping. So I challenge you to ask yourself, do you want to do things that people merely consume or watch or laugh at? Do you want to be just a consumer of things? Or do you want to be like Prometheus, bringing us the gift of fire from the gods, so that we may all see what may be illuminated in that flickering light? It's a question not only for you as students, not only for you as parents, but also to all of you as teachers. Teachers who know things that you can share with others, whether it's friendship bracelets, or how to solve certain kinds of equations, or how to be a really, really kind person. These are things that you know you've taught other people, and you can continue to teach. So I want us to move beyond artificial separations of who's a student and who's a teacher, of what subject is which, and simply think about how we can all work together toward a goal of learning more and in better ways. And I would love to hear your suggestions, your thoughts on how we can make schools better, on what you would love to see in your own education, especially from the kids we have here, and answer any questions. Started just rattling it off. And she just stared at me and she was like, whoa, okay, I believe you now. That was, like, I still have that feeling today. Learning to read is great. So, any final comments or questions?
Also, like when like I was in third grade or something, my dad taught me like multiplication. Like he'll teach me and then I won't really get it, and then like tell me more, and then I'll get it and I'll get the answer to the question, so I'll ask me more and I'll get all excited.
That's awesome. Learning how to do multiplication from Dad, that is definitely one I can relate to.
Yeah, I've been loving lately having things that I learned in the past that I was just very interested in learning that I had no idea would serve me in the long run. Now in my more mature life, figuring out how they fit into the puzzle and realizing that they contribute meaningfully to what I'm living now.
That is great. I'm right now, and thank you so much for taking the time to come here.
Thank you, Dora, and thank you, Joyce,